This is a mini lecture on the Black Death, also known as the Plague. Now, during the Middle Ages, we're talking about 14th, 15th centuries, there were more than one of these things that we now call the plague. It were episodes of widespread death in Western Europe took place for a number of different reasons. One of those reasons was a famine which took place, began in 1315, and we have a wave of the plague happening in the mid-14th century. 1347 to 1350 is what we now call the Black Death. This was the biggest health crisis, to use our modern-day language, in Europe at the time. Disease was transferred from Genghis Khan's army, we now know, Mongolia, and in the east, on ships and through traders, sailors, who would bring this, it was called Yersinia pestis, E. pestis. It was an organism that was in the bloodstream of rodents, rats and mice, and in the stomach of fleas that fed on the rodents. And so this quickly spread. The rats would get on the ships, and the ships would go to another city, and then you've got a crisis happening there, and then a crisis happening in another city. And it continued to spread throughout Europe to the point that thousands of people were being killed. That was called the bubonic plague. We're talking about large swellings, boil-like, the size of almonds, which were all over the place. If you look at some of the pictures in my PowerPoint, those paintings give you a glimpse into what it may have looked like. It was fatal in most cases. There's also the pneumonic plague, which is transferred through breathing. Pneuma means breath, and so the pneumonic plague was transferred by breathing, and the lungs were attacked, and most everybody who had that would die. It's an estimated between 40 and 50% of the population of Europe passed away because of the plague, and in a little over 2 years, 30 million to 40 million people lost their lives because of the plague. So the church is in this position of saying, how do we respond to all of this death around us? Well, there was three key responses to them. One was to blame the Jewish people. Now, in history, Jews are often seen as a scapegoat, and they were charged with poisoning the wells, the water wells of the Christians. And a significant number of Jews were burned in cities around Europe. And the Pope, Clement VI, responded by opening the gates to the papal palace in Avignon to Jews who were fleeing persecution. And he called on Christians everywhere to act with tolerance and threatened to excommunicate people who were blaming Jews. He pointed out that the Jews were actually dying alongside the Christians, so why would they poison their own water wells? It's a good response by Clement VI. Another response was the flagellants. Now, the hysteria of death was responded to in many ways, and one of those ways was, it's called flagellation. And a flagellant is one who does physical acts of harm to themselves as a way of telling God, we're sorry, of penitence is the language. And so they would go around to different cities and beat themselves on the back with pieces of glass and rope and leather as a way of saying sorry to God, because they were associating all of this death with sin in their lives. And the third response was called the Dance Macabre, or the Dance of Death. And if you get a chance to go to Lucerne in Switzerland, or again, take a look at the PowerPoint, you'll see these pictures. Death became a very interesting topic. I mean, it's at the forefront of everybody's mind right now. Why is everyone dying? And so people in the church had to try and respond to this. One of the responses to death wasn't to try and answer for it, but was to try and decide what happens after we die. Where do we go? What do we do? What's in between, Jesus' return and our lives now? And is there some kind of an in-between point? Well, this is where the development of, or the emergence of purgatory came to be as a response to all of the death because of the plague. And so purgatory became an answer to the question of what happens after you die. Well, you're in a holding place. You're in a place in between death and Jesus' return, at which point you have a chance to gain forgiveness of your sins. Now, if you were a really bad person in this life, then your time in purgatory is quite long. If you are very holy and a good person in this life, your purgatory time was quite short. But the development of purgatory moved into an area of gaining the forgiveness of sins, both in this life and in the afterlife, both for you and for your relatives. Now, this issue comes to a head in what we now call the Protestant Reformation. One of the key things that Martin Luther responded to was this issue of indulgences, paying for sins to get out of purgatory. So, the Black Death, the plague, another big moment in the history of the church in the Middle Ages.